In 1854, the California gold rush had transformed the Sierra Nevada foothills into a landscape of desperate ambition and moral decay. Among the mining camps scattered across Placer County, the settlement of Auburn had grown from a handful of tents to a bustling community of nearly 3,000 souls, all chasing the promise of fortune buried in the earth. It was here, in this crucible of greed and isolation, that Sarah Margaret Brown would orchestrate one of the most calculated acts of betrayal and murder ever documented in the early records of California territory. The discovery that would eventually unravel Sarah's carefully constructed web of deception began on a cold morning in March of 1868. 14 years after the events that would come to define Auburn's darkest chapter, a crew of Chinese laborers working to expand the railroad grade east of town uncovered what they initially believed to be a cache of mining equipment buried beneath 6 feet of carefully arranged river stones. What they found instead would send shockwaves through a community that had long since forgotten the disappearance of Thomas William Parker, a local prospector whose vanishing in the autumn of 1854 had been attributed to the countless dangers that claimed men's lives in the goldfields. The skeletal remains were wrapped in what had once been an expensive silk dress, now reduced to brittle fragments that crumbled at the slightest touch. But it was not the bones themselves that captured the attention of the territorial authorities. Scattered throughout the makeshift grave, investigators found more than 40 ounces of raw gold nuggets carefully placed around the body in a pattern that suggested deliberate arrangement rather than random burial. The gold bore the distinctive characteristics of ore from the American River claims, specifically from a section that had been worked exclusively by Parker and his mining partner, a man named David Joseph Martinez. Sarah Brown had arrived in Auburn during the spring of 1853, part of the wave of women who came west, not as prospectors, but as providers of the services that mining camps desperately needed. She established a boarding house on the main thoroughfare, a 2-story structure that quickly became known for its cleanliness and the quality of meals served to the miners who could afford such luxuries. Contemporary accounts describe her as a woman of striking appearance, with auburn hair and an ability to command attention in rooms full of men who had not seen a respectable woman in months. The boarding house records, discovered decades later in the basement of what had been the Auburn Methodist Church, reveal that Thomas Parker became a regular resident in the summer of 1853. Parker, according to these same records, was a man of 32 years who had come west from Ohio with enough capital to purchase quality mining equipment and hire help when needed. His claim, located 3 miles northeast of Auburn along a bend in the American River, had proven moderately successful, yielding enough gold to afford him comfortable lodgings and regular meals at Sarah's establishment. What the records do not reveal, but what would later be reconstructed from witness testimonies and personal correspondence found hidden in Sarah's effects, was the intimate relationship that developed between the boarding house proprietress and her longest-term resident. Letters discovered in 1869 during the demolition of the boarding house, hidden behind a false wall in Sarah's private chambers, paint a picture of a passionate but increasingly troubled affair that began in the autumn of 1853. In one letter, dated November of 1853 and written in Parker's distinctive hand, he describes his intention to expand his mining operation and his desire to make Sarah his wife once his financial situation allowed for proper courtship. The letter speaks of his discovery of a particularly rich vein of gold-bearing quartz, and his plans to extract what he believed could be several hundred ounces of high-quality ore before the winter rains made mining impossible. But it was in Sarah's private journal, also discovered in 1869, that the true nature of their relationship and her ultimate intentions became clear. The journal, written in a cipher that took territorial authorities nearly 6 months to decode, reveals a woman consumed not with love, but with a calculated plan to acquire Parker's wealth through deception and ultimately murder. The journal entries from the winter of 1853 and 1854 describe in meticulous detail Sarah's growing knowledge of Parker's mining operation, the location of his most productive claims, and his habit of storing processed gold in a locked strongbox kept in his room at the boarding house. More troubling, the entries reveal Sarah's awareness that Parker had begun to suspect his mining partner Martinez of stealing gold from their shared claims. According to the decoded journal, Sarah actively encouraged Parker's suspicions about Martinez, going so far as to plant evidence that suggested the Mexican-born miner was secretly removing ore from their joint operation. She describes manipulating conversations between the two men, reporting false observations about Martinez's activities, and gradually convincing Parker that his partner planned to abandon their agreement and claim the most productive sections of their mine for himself. The final entry in Sarah's journal, dated September 15, 1854, reads simply, "The preparations are complete. Thomas trusts me completely, and Martinez will soon have no choice but to flee. What happens next will secure my future and remove any obstacles to my freedom." On September 20th, 1854, Thomas Parker failed to return from his daily visit to the mining claim. Martinez, according to his later testimony to territorial authorities, had not seen Parker since the previous morning, when they had argued about missing equipment and Martinez's alleged theft of gold from their shared operation. When Parker did not appear at the boarding house for his evening meal, Sarah Brown reported his absence to the informal law enforcement that existed in Auburn at the time. Sheriff John Christopher Dalton, a former Army sergeant who had accepted the position of territorial sheriff just 6 months earlier, conducted what passed for an investigation in the crude frontier justice system of 1854. He interviewed Martinez, who claimed that Parker had accused him of theft and threatened to involve the territorial authorities. Faced with these accusations and the hostile atmosphere that surrounded Mexican miners in the goldfields, Martinez had decided to abandon his claims and leave Auburn immediately. The sheriff's report, filed with the territorial government in Sacramento and discovered in the state archives in 1962, describes a brief search of Parker's claim that revealed signs of a struggle near the main shaft. Mining tools were scattered about, and there were indications that someone had attempted to remove equipment from the site. More significantly, Parker's locked strongbox, which Sarah Brown confirmed had contained his accumulated gold, was nowhere to be found. Based on Martinez's suspicious departure and the evidence of theft at the mining site, Sheriff Dalton concluded that the Mexican miner had murdered Parker during a dispute over gold and had fled with his victim's accumulated wealth. A warrant was issued for Martinez's arrest, but the man had vanished completely, presumably returning to Mexico or disappearing into one of the many anonymous mining camps scattered throughout California territory. Sarah Brown's reaction to Parker's disappearance, as described in contemporary accounts from other boarding house residents, was that of a woman devastated by the loss of a dear friend and valued customer. She closed the boarding house for 3 days in mourning and reportedly spent hours in the small chapel that served Auburn's Methodist congregation, praying for Parker's soul and for justice to be served against his killer. But the same boarding house residents who described Sarah's grief also noted subtle changes in her behavior and circumstances following Parker's disappearance. Within a month, she had purchased additional property adjacent to her boarding house, expanding her operations significantly. She hired additional staff, upgraded the furnishings throughout the building, and began offering services that attracted a more prosperous clientele from the surrounding mining camps. When questioned about her sudden prosperity, Sarah explained that Parker had left her a substantial sum in his will, recognizing her kindness and the debt he owed for her care during his time in Auburn. The will, presented to territorial authorities and filed with the appropriate offices, appeared to be genuine and was witnessed by two men who had since departed Auburn for mining opportunities elsewhere. For nearly 14 years, Sarah Brown's version of events remained the accepted truth. Thomas Parker had been murdered by his disgruntled partner, who had stolen his accumulated gold and fled justice. Sarah had inherited a modest sum that allowed her to expand her business and become one of Auburn's most respected businesswomen. Sheriff Dalton had conducted a thorough investigation within the limitations of frontier law enforcement and had correctly identified the perpetrator, even though the killer had escaped prosecution. This narrative might have remained unchallenged indefinitely if not for the discovery of Parker's remains in 1868 and the subsequent investigation led by a new generation of law enforcement officers trained in more sophisticated methods of criminal investigation. Captain William Henry Morrison, a former Union Army intelligence officer who had accepted the position of Placer County Sheriff in 1867, approached the case with a methodical attention to detail that had been absent from the original investigation. Morrison's first observation concerned the location where Parker's body had been discovered. The burial site, situated nearly 5 miles from Parker's mining claim, and in the opposite direction from any known route Martinez might have taken to flee Auburn, suggested that whoever had killed and buried Parker possessed intimate knowledge of the local terrain and had access to resources that would have been unavailable to a fleeing suspect. The arrangement of gold nuggets around Parker's remains presented another puzzle that challenged the accepted narrative. If Martinez had killed Parker for his gold, why would the murderer have buried valuable ore with the body instead of keeping it? The gold found in the grave represented several months of successful mining, far too valuable to simply abandon in a hidden burial site. More significantly, Morrison's investigation revealed discrepancies in the will that had supposedly left Sarah Brown her inheritance. Document analysis conducted by territorial authorities in Sacramento determined that the ink used to write the will was of a type that had not been available in Auburn until months after Parker's disappearance. The paper, while aged appropriately, bore watermarks from a mill in San Francisco that had not begun operations until 1855. Armed with this evidence, Morrison obtained a warrant to search Sarah Brown's property thoroughly. The search, conducted in November of 1868, uncovered not only the hidden letters and encoded journal that revealed Sarah's true relationship with Parker, but also a collection of mining tools that matched descriptions of equipment missing from Parker's claim. Most damning, investigators discovered a small leather pouch containing gold dust that, when analyzed, proved to be identical in composition to ore from Parker's most productive mining sites. When confronted with this evidence, Sarah Brown initially maintained her innocence, claiming that any gold in her possession had been legitimately inherited from Parker's estate. But as Morrison methodically presented the decoded journal entries, the forged will, and the physical evidence linking her to Parker's murder, her carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The confession that Sarah Brown eventually provided to territorial authorities, recorded in detail and preserved in the Placer County legal archives, revealed a crime of calculated cruelty that shocked even the hardened residents of the mining camps. According to her statement, the murder had been planned for months, with Sarah carefully manipulating both Parker and Martinez to create the perfect cover for her crime. On the morning of September 20th, 1854, Sarah had sent a message to Parker at his mining claim, claiming that Martinez had been seen with suspicious amounts of gold and asking Parker to meet her at a secluded location to discuss what should be done. Parker, trusting completely in Sarah's loyalty and concerned about his partner's alleged theft, agreed to the meeting without suspicion. The location Sarah had chosen was a natural depression in the hills northeast of Auburn, surrounded by dense brush and far from any established mining claims or travel routes. She had prepared the site in advance, digging what appeared to be a prospect hole, but was actually intended as Parker's grave. When Parker arrived, Sarah shot him with a small caliber pistol she had purchased weeks earlier from a traveling merchant. But Sarah's cruelty extended far beyond simple murder. According to her confession, she had deliberately allowed Parker to remain alive and conscious for several minutes after the shooting, using the time to explain her true intentions and to describe how she planned to frame Martinez for the killing. She wanted Parker to understand completely how thoroughly he had been betrayed by the woman he had trusted and loved. After Parker died, Sarah stripped his body of clothing and personal effects, wrapped him in one of her own dresses to confuse any future investigation, and buried him in the prepared grave. She then scattered gold nuggets from Parker's own collection around the body, creating the illusion of a ritual burial that she hoped would suggest Mexican or Indian involvement if the remains were ever discovered. The forged will had been prepared months in advance, with Sarah practicing Parker's handwriting until she could reproduce it convincingly. The witnesses who had supposedly signed the document were fictional, their names borrowed from passenger manifests of ships that had departed San Francisco for destinations unknown. By the time any investigation might locate them, Sarah had assumed they would be impossible to find. Most chillingly, Sarah's confession revealed that she had monitored Sheriff Dalton's investigation carefully, even going so far as to plant additional evidence against Martinez to ensure that suspicion remained focused on the fled Mexican miner. She had placed some of Parker's mining tools at locations where Martinez was known to have worked, creating a trail of evidence that supported the narrative of theft and murder she had constructed. The trial of Sarah Margaret Brown began in Sacramento in February of 1869, attracting attention from newspapers throughout California and beyond. The case represented one of the first criminal prosecutions in California territory to rely heavily on physical evidence and scientific analysis rather than witness testimony alone. The forged documents, the gold analysis, and the coded journal entries provided a level of detail that made Sarah's guilt undeniable. But the trial also revealed disturbing questions about the original investigation conducted by Sheriff Dalton. Defense attorneys raised the possibility that Dalton had been deliberately negligent in his investigation, either through incompetence or because he had been compromised by Sarah Brown herself. Evidence presented during the trial suggested that Dalton had visited Sarah's boarding house frequently in the months following Parker's disappearance, and that he had failed to pursue several obvious lines of investigation that might have revealed inconsistencies in Sarah's story. Testimony from boarding house residents described Dalton as unusually attentive to Sarah's comfort and well-being during the period of the investigation. He had reportedly spent hours questioning her about Parker's habits and associations, but witnesses noted that these interviews seemed more social than professional in nature. More troubling, several residents testified that Dalton had specifically instructed them not to discuss Parker's relationship with Sarah, claiming that such information was irrelevant to the investigation. The relationship between Sarah Brown and Sheriff Dalton became a central focus of the trial, when prosecutors presented evidence that the sheriff had received several substantial payments from Sarah during the months following Parker's disappearance. Bank records from Sacramento showed that Sarah had made cash deposits totaling more than $200 in Dalton's name, amounts that far exceeded the sheriff's legitimate salary and could not be explained by any other source of income. Under cross-examination, Dalton claimed that the payments represented loans Sarah had made to help him establish a small ranch outside Auburn. But when pressed for details about this arrangement, his testimony became increasingly contradictory and unconvincing. More damaging, prosecutors produced correspondence between Sarah and a San Francisco attorney in which she discussed the need to ensure that local law enforcement remained cooperative with her business interests. The prosecution argued that Sarah had systematically corrupted Sheriff Dalton, using both financial incentives and personal manipulation to ensure that his investigation of Parker's disappearance would reach the predetermined conclusion that Martinez was responsible. By framing the fled Mexican miner, Sarah had not only escaped suspicion herself, but had also acquired a corrupt law enforcement officer who could protect her from any future scrutiny. The evidence against both Sarah Brown and Sheriff Dalton proved overwhelming. Sarah was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment at the California State Prison for Women, a facility that had been established just 2 years earlier to house the growing number of female criminals in the expanding state. Dalton faced charges of corruption and obstruction of justice, ultimately receiving a 10-year sentence and permanent disbarment from any future law enforcement positions. But the case's most lasting impact extended beyond the punishment of those directly responsible for Parker's death. The investigation revealed systematic problems with law enforcement in the mining regions, where isolated communities often relied on informal justice systems that were vulnerable to corruption and manipulation. The territorial government responded by implementing new standards for sheriff appointments and requiring regular oversight of criminal investigations in remote areas. The fate of David Martinez, the Mexican miner who had been falsely accused of Parker's murder, remained unknown until 1872, when a letter arrived at the Placer County Sheriff's Office from a Catholic mission in Sonora, Mexico. The letter, written by a priest on behalf of Martinez, who had died of pneumonia the previous winter, provided a detailed account of his flight from Auburn and his life in exile following the false accusations. According to the priest's letter, Martinez had indeed fled Auburn immediately after arguing with Parker, but only because he had experienced similar accusations and persecution at previous mining camps, and feared for his safety in the hostile atmosphere surrounding Mexican miners. He had spent the intervening years working small claims in Sonora, never accumulating enough wealth to return to California or to attempt to clear his name. The letter described Martinez as a man broken by the injustice he had suffered, consumed by bitterness over the loss of his legitimate mining claims and the destruction of his reputation. The priest's account revealed that Martinez had maintained his innocence regarding Parker's murder until his death, insisting that he had never harmed his mining partner despite their disagreements about missing equipment and gold. He had attributed their conflicts to Parker's increasing paranoia and suspicion, which Martinez believed had been influenced by outside sources, though he had never suspected the true extent of Sarah Brown's manipulation. Martinez had died believing that his name would never be cleared, and that history would record him as a murderer and thief. The priest's letter requested that territorial authorities take steps to acknowledge Martinez's innocence publicly and to ensure that official records reflected the true circumstances of Parker's death. This request led to a formal declaration by the Placer County government in 1873, posthumously clearing Martinez of all accusations related to Parker's disappearance and acknowledging the injustice he had suffered. The Auburn boarding house that had served as Sarah Brown's base of operations was sold at auction in 1869 to satisfy debts accumulated during her legal defense. The building changed hands several times over the following years, serving various purposes as Auburn's economy shifted away from mining toward agriculture and trade. Local residents reported persistent problems with the structure, including unexplained sounds, doors that would not remain closed, and a pervasive odor of decay that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. In 1878, The building was finally demolished after a fire of unknown origin damaged the structure beyond repair. During the demolition, workers discovered additional evidence of Sarah's crimes, including a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards that contained more forged documents and a detailed map showing the locations of several mining claims around Auburn. The map included notes in Sarah's handwriting describing the wealth and vulnerability of various prospectors, suggesting that Parker might not have been her only intended victim. The discovery of this map prompted a review of other unsolved disappearances from the Auburn area during the 1850s. Territorial authorities identified at least 3 other cases of missing miners, whose circumstances shared disturbing similarities with Parker's murder. All had been successful prospectors who had stayed at Sarah's boarding house, all had reportedly been involved in disputes with mining partners, and all had vanished without leaving clear evidence of their fate. Unfortunately, the passage of time and the informal nature of record-keeping in the mining camps made it impossible to conduct meaningful investigations into these additional cases. The suspected victims' remains were never found, and most of the potential witnesses had died or moved away by the time authorities began their review. Sarah Brown herself, when questioned about these other disappearances during her imprisonment, maintained that Parker's murder had been an isolated incident motivated by specific circumstances. The case of Sarah Brown and Thomas Parker became a cautionary tale throughout the mining regions of California, illustrating the dangers that could emerge when isolation, greed, and weak institutions created opportunities for systematic criminal behavior. Law enforcement agencies throughout the West studied the investigation as an example of how thorough detective work could uncover even carefully planned crimes, but also as a warning about the corruption that could flourish in communities lacking proper oversight. Sarah Brown spent the remaining years of her life in the California State Prison for Women, where she became known as an intelligent and manipulative inmate who attempted to orchestrate various schemes involving other prisoners and corrupt guards. Prison records describe her as unrepentant regarding Parker's murder, maintaining that she had simply taken advantage of opportunities that any intelligent person would have recognized. She died in 1886, reportedly from complications related to tuberculosis, having never expressed genuine remorse for her crimes. Sheriff John Christopher Dalton served 7 years of his 10-year sentence before being released on parole for good behavior. He disappeared immediately upon his release, with some reports placing him in Oregon and others suggesting he had traveled to Alaska during the gold rush there. His ultimate fate remains unknown, but law enforcement records contain no evidence that he ever again held any position of authority or trust. The location where Thomas Parker's remains were discovered became known locally as Parker's Rest, though official maps never adopted this designation. The site remained undisturbed for several decades, but gradual development of the area for agricultural purposes eventually obliterated any trace of the original burial location. Today, the land forms part of a commercial orchard, and few residents of modern Auburn are aware of the events that occurred there more than a century and a half ago. The case files related to Sarah Brown's prosecution were transferred to the California State Archives in the 1920s, where they remain available to researchers studying the development of criminal justice systems in the American West. The coded journal and forged documents have become valuable examples for historians examining the sophistication of criminal activity during the gold rush period, challenging popular assumptions about the crude and impulsive nature of frontier crime. In 1968, exactly 100 years after the discovery of Parker's remains, the Placer County Historical Society published a comprehensive account of the case as part of their series on significant events in local history. The publication drew renewed attention to the sophisticated nature of Sarah Brown's crimes and their impact on the development of professional law enforcement in California. However, the Society's account was criticized by some historians for sensationalizing aspects of the case and for failing to adequately address the broader social issues that had made such crimes possible. Modern forensic experts who have examined the surviving evidence from the case note that Sarah Brown's methods demonstrated an understanding of criminal investigation techniques that was remarkably advanced for the 1850s. Her efforts to misdirect suspicion, destroy physical evidence, and corrupt law enforcement officials showed a level of planning and sophistication that anticipated developments in criminal science by several decades. Some scholars have suggested that her case represents one of the earliest examples of what would later be recognized as organized criminal behavior in the American West. The story of Thomas Parker's murder and Sarah Brown's calculated betrayal continues to resonate as an example of how individual greed and moral corruption could flourish in the isolated communities of the frontier period. The case demonstrates both the vulnerability of those who trusted too readily and the potential for systematic evil to masquerade as respectability and caring. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that Sarah's crimes might have continued indefinitely, if not for the accidental discovery of Parker's remains 14 years after his murder. Her successful manipulation of both personal relationships and official institutions created a perfect cover for her criminal activities, allowing her to profit from murder while maintaining her reputation as a respectable businesswoman and pillar of the community. The gold that Sarah Brown had scattered around Parker's grave, apparently as part of some elaborate misdirection, was eventually returned to what remained of his family in Ohio. The sum represented substantial wealth by the standards of the 1850s, enough to have provided Parker with a comfortable life if he had lived to enjoy it. Instead, it served only as a monument to the greed and calculation that had cost him his life. On quiet evenings in modern Auburn, when the wind moves through the oak trees that now shade the commercial district, some long-time residents claim they can still hear echoes of the past. The sound might be nothing more than branches creaking in the breeze, but local folklore insists it carries the whispered warnings of those who learn too late that trust in the wrong hands can become the deadliest weapon of all. The records of Sarah Margaret Brown's crimes remain sealed in the California State Archives, a reminder that even in the seemingly simple world of the gold rush frontier, human nature could manifest itself in ways both sophisticated and deeply evil. Her story serves as a permanent warning that the greatest dangers often come not from strangers in the wilderness, but from those we welcome into our homes and hearts, believing them to share our hopes and dreams when they see only opportunity and prey. And perhaps on those same quiet evenings when the wind carries its mysterious sounds through Auburn's streets, the memory of Thomas William Parker still wanders the hills where he once searched for gold, serving as an eternal reminder that some betrayals cut so deep they leave scars on the very landscape itself, wounds that time can never fully heal. The investigation into Sarah Brown's methods revealed that she had maintained detailed records of every aspect of her criminal enterprise, treating murder and fraud with the same methodical approach she applied to running her boarding house. These records, discovered during the final search of her property, showed that she had studied the habits and weaknesses of potential victims for months before acting, identifying those who possessed sufficient wealth to justify the risks involved. Among her papers, investigators found sketches of various mining claims around Auburn, complete with notes about production levels, security measures, and the personal relationships of the claim owners. Parker's claim was marked with particular attention to detail, including observations about his daily routine, his trust in Martinez, and his growing attachment to Sarah herself. The notes revealed a predator who had systematically identified and groomed her victim over nearly a year. The final entries in Sarah's records, written in the weeks before Parker's murder, showed her calculating the optimal timing for the crime. She had noted the approach of winter, when mining activity would slow and people would be less likely to notice disruptions in normal routines. She had also tracked Martinez's increasing frustration with Parker's accusations, recognizing that the Mexican miner's eventual departure would provide the perfect scapegoat for her planned murder. Most chilling among these documents was a list of other potential victims, including detailed assessments of their wealth, vulnerability, and the feasibility of eliminating them without detection. The list included 7 names beyond Parker's, representing successful miners whose disappearances could potentially be attributed to the various dangers of frontier life. 2 of these men had indeed vanished during the period of Sarah's operation, their fates remaining unknown despite the later investigation. The discovery of these records prompted territorial authorities to issue warnings throughout the mining regions, alerting communities to the possibility that other seemingly respectable establishments might be operating similar criminal enterprises. The case became a catalyst for improved communication between isolated communities and more systematic tracking of missing persons in the goldfields. Sarah Brown's execution was carried out at San Quentin Prison in January of 1870, making her one of the first women to face capital punishment in California territory. Contemporary accounts describe her as maintaining her composure until the end, showing neither remorse for her crimes nor fear of their consequences. Her final words, recorded by prison officials, were reported as, "I regret only that I was discovered." The land where Parker had worked his claims eventually became part of a larger agricultural development, but local residents noted that the soil in certain areas remained barren despite repeated attempts at cultivation. Farmers reported that crops planted near the former mining sites would wither without explanation, leading to superstitions about the ground being somehow cursed by the violence it had witnessed. In the decades that followed, Auburn grew into a prosperous agricultural center, eventually becoming connected to Sacramento by railroad and losing most traces of its violent mining past. The boarding house site where Sarah Brown had operated became a small park, though city planners were careful not to memorialize the location's dark history in any official capacity. The case files were transferred to state archives in 1890, where they remain accessible to researchers studying the criminal history of the Gold Rush period. The sophisticated nature of Sarah's crimes continues to surprise historians, challenging assumptions about the crude and impulsive character often attributed to frontier criminal activity. On winter evenings, when fog rolls up from the American River and settles over Auburn's quiet streets, longtime residents sometimes speak of hearing sounds that cannot quite be explained. The whispers might be nothing more than wind through the valley oaks, but local folklore insists they carry the voices of those who trusted too easily and paid the ultimate price for their faith in human nature. Thomas Parker's name appears on a memorial erected by the Placer County Historical Society in 1924, honoring the victims of Gold Rush violence. The inscription reads simply, "Thomas William Parker, 1822 to 1854, whose trust became his epitaph." Below his name, a smaller inscription acknowledges David Martinez as an innocent man wrongly accused, ensuring that history would remember both the victim and the man falsely blamed for his death. The gold that had been scattered around Parker's grave was eventually donated to the California State Museum, where it forms part of an exhibit on mining techniques of the 1850s. Museum visitors examining the nuggets have no way of knowing they once served as props in an elaborate murder scene, carefully placed by a killer who understood that even in death, her victim would continue to serve her purposes. Sarah Margaret Brown's story remains a stark reminder that evil can flourish anywhere human greed encounters opportunity and weak institutions. Her calculated betrayal of trust and systematic corruption of justice represent a dark chapter in California's early history, one that continues to echo in the quiet valleys where gold once promised fortune but delivered only death and deception.